The message popped up on his phone at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a regular Tuesday afternoon. For a moment, he just stared at it, his coffee growing cold beside his laptop. The text wasn't meant for him, that much was clear. But seeing his ex-wife's name on his screen after 5 years made his heart skip a beat. Coach Mike, Emmy's been having trouble sleeping before the big games. The anxiety is getting worse. Could we schedule a meeting to discuss this? He read it 3 times, each time feeling like someone had punched him in the stomach. Emmy, his teenage daughter. Anxiety. How had he not known about this? Sitting in his top-floor office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the billionaire tech mogul suddenly felt very small. The empire he'd built, the success everyone talked about in business magazines, the wealth that could buy almost anything, none of it had told him that his own daughter was struggling. The last time he'd seen Annie was 2 months ago, at a rushed dinner he'd squeezed in between meetings. She'd seemed quiet, but he'd attributed it to typical teenage behavior. Now looking back, he could see all the signs he'd missed. The way she'd pushed her food around the plate, how she'd changed the subject when he'd asked about soccer, the dark circles under her eyes that he'd blamed on too much studying. His fingers hovered over the phone's keyboard. The right thing would be to let his ex-wife know she'd sent the message to the wrong number. But something made him pause. In that moment, memories flooded back. Amy's first steps, teaching her to ride a bike, the way she used to climb into his lap with a book when she was little. When had he stopped being that dad? When had spreadsheets and board meetings become more important than bedtime stories and soccer games? He got up from his desk and walked to the window, watching the tiny cars move like ants far below. The message was still open on his phone, a digital reminder of how far he'd drifted from what really mattered. 5 years ago, when the divorce papers were signed, he'd told himself it was for the best. He convinced himself that providing financially was enough, that his children would understand someday why he couldn't be there for the small moments. The calendar on his desk showed 3 board meetings scheduled for the next day, a conference call with investors, and a lunch with potential partners. All crucial for the company's growth, all meaningless compared to what he'd just learned about his daughter. Opening his laptop, he began to search through old photos stored in his cloud drive. There she was, Amy at her 10th birthday party, beaming at the camera with cake on her chin. In the background, he could see himself on the phone, half turned away from the celebration. The timestamp showed it was taken just months before the divorce. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, reminding him about an upcoming meeting. For the first time in years, he did something that would have been unthinkable that morning. He pressed the button and said, "Cancel everything for the rest of the day." Walking back to his desk, he picked up his phone again. The message still waited for a response. His fingers began to type, then stopped. Then typed again, then deleted. What right did he have to step back into their lives now? But a deeper question burned in his mind. What right did he have to stay away when his daughter needed support? Outside his office, the bustling corporate world continued its usual pace. Inside, a father sat at his desk, staring at a mistaken text message that had somehow managed to crack open the carefully constructed wall between his old life and his new one. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his office floor, he made a decision that would change everything. He pulled up his calendar again, this time not to check his meetings but to look at something else, the upcoming dates of every soccer game in his daughter's league schedule. As he noted them down, a small voice in his head whispered that it might be too late, that too much time had passed, that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt. But for the first time in years, he wasn't listening to that voice. Instead, he was remembering something his own father had told him long ago: time passes anyway. The question is whether you'll spend it on what matters. With trembling fingers, he began to type a reply to his ex-wife's message, knowing that whatever came next would require more courage than any business deal he'd ever made. The truth has a way of sneaking up on you when you least expect it. For the billionaire father, it came through a casual conversation with his old friend at a coffee shop downtown, far from his usual expensive restaurants and business meetings. "I saw your ex-wife at the grocery store last week," his friend mentioned, stirring his coffee absently. "She was checking prices, comparing brands. You know, the way people do when they're trying to make ends meet." The words hit him like a splash of cold water. He'd always assumed the generous divorce settlement would take care of everything. But his friend wasn't finished. "She's working 2 jobs now, did you know? Teaching during the day and doing online tutoring in the evenings. Says she wants to set an example for the kids about earning your own way." His coffee sat untouched, growing cold as his friend continued painting a picture of the life he'd been too busy to notice. His ex-wife, once a talented artist who filled their home with paintings, hadn't touched a canvas in years. Too tired, too busy trying to keep their old house, refusing to sell it because it was the only home their children had ever known. Later that day, he found himself parked across from their son's middle school, watching kids pour out of the building. He spotted his boy immediately, shoulders slightly hunched, walking alone, headphones firmly in place. A group of kids passed by with skateboards, laughing and talking. His son didn't even look up. "He never mentions you anymore." Another mutual friend had told him over the phone. When someone asks about his dad, he just shrugs and changes the subject. "But I've seen him reading articles about your company online. He keeps track of everything you do, even if he pretends not to care." The weight of these revelations felt heavier than any business crisis he'd ever faced. In his office, surrounded by awards and achievements, he opened his laptop and began searching through social media, something he'd always been too busy to do before. His daughter's Instagram showed a bright smile in every photo, but he noticed something his businessman's eye had trained him to see: patterns. The same forced smile, the same careful pose, the same hidden anxiety he should have recognized because he carried it himself as a teenager before money and success had taught him to mask it better. A text from his assistant lit up his phone, another invitation to a prestigious business dinner. Without hesitation, he typed back a rejection. Instead, he found himself scrolling through old family photos on his phone, stopping at one from 7 years ago, a camping trip where everything had started to unravel. In the photo, his ex-wife was teaching their daughter how to roast marshmallows while their son built an elaborate stick fortress nearby. He remembered getting frustrated that weekend because the cell reception was poor, remembered spending hours on the phone trying to solve a work crisis while his family enjoyed the sunset without him. The revelation struck him harder than any business setback. His wealth, carefully invested and multiplied over the years, had become a wall rather than a bridge. He'd thought providing financial security would be enough, that private schools and unlimited allowances could substitute for presence. Now he understood the bitter irony. His ex-wife worked 2 jobs not because she needed the money, but because she needed to show their children that life wasn't about what you had, but what you gave. He pulled up his banking app and stared at the numbers that had defined his success for so long. The figures that once filled him with pride now seemed hollow. His son's latest report card, obtained through the school's parent portal he'd rarely checked before, showed straight as in math and science, but concerning notes about social interaction and participation. "He's brilliant," his teacher had written, "but he never raises his hand in class. He seems afraid to take up space." The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built his fortune creating spaces for people to connect digitally, while failing to maintain the most important connections in his own life. His company's mission statement, proudly displayed in every office, talked about bringing people together. Meanwhile, his own family had drifted apart like continents after a seismic shift. As evening settled over the city, he remained in his office, surrounded by the trappings of success that suddenly felt meaningless. On his desk, a recent business magazine featured his face on the cover, hailing him as a visionary leader. But all he could think about was his daughter's anxiety before soccer games, his son's quiet withdrawal, and his ex-wife's determination to rebuild a life he'd helped shatter. The next steps seemed both crystal clear and terrifyingly difficult. Money couldn't fix this. He'd finally learned that lesson. This would require something he'd forgotten how to give: time, presence, and the courage to be vulnerable. As he picked up his phone to make the first of many changes, he realized that the hardest deals aren't the ones that make you richer, but the ones that force you to admit how poor you've been in the things that truly matter. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest steps. For the first time in his career, the billionaire CEO walked into his board meeting with an announcement that left everyone stunned. He was taking a leave of absence. No explanation offered, no timeline given. The whispers started immediately, but he had stopped caring about whispers. Instead of his usual luxury high-rise apartment, he moved into a modest 2-bedroom place just 10 minutes from his old house. No fancy furniture, no expensive art on the walls. Just the basics and a small desk where he could work when needed. His assistant thought he was having a midlife crisis. Maybe he was, but it felt more like finally waking up. The first soccer game he attended was on a chilly Saturday morning. He parked his car, not the expensive sports car, but a regular sedan he bought specifically for this new chapter, and walked to the field. His heart was pounding harder than it ever had before any business presentation. He chose a spot at the back of the bleachers, trying to blend in with the other parents. His daughter was easy to spot on the field, her ponytail swinging as she moved. He noticed how she kept glancing at the sidelines where her mom stood with the other parents, seeking reassurance. The anxiety his ex-wife had mentioned in that accidental text was visible in every hesitant move she made. When halftime came, he stayed in his seat, resisting the urge to go down and talk to them. This wasn't about him or what he wanted. It was about them, about showing up consistently without expecting anything in return. He'd learned from enough business negotiations that sometimes the best strategy was simply to be present and patient. A week later, he found himself standing in the back of a middle school gymnasium, watching his son set up his science fair project. The robot his boy had built wasn't the fanciest there. Some kids had clearly had adult help and expensive parts, but it was entirely original. He could see his son's personality in every carefully soldered joint and hand-coded function. His ex-wife spotted him first. She was helping another parent set up when she turned and saw him. For a moment, they just looked at each other across the crowded gym. He saw the questions in her eyes, probably the same ones everyone had. Was this real? Would it last? Or was this just another phase before he disappeared into his work again? He stayed at the back, giving them space, but when his son's turn came to present his project, he moved closer to hear. The boy's voice was quiet but sure as he explained how he built everything himself, how he'd learned coding from online tutorials, how he'd solved each problem as it came up. Pride swelled in his chest, not the familiar pride of business achievements, but something deeper and more painful. When his son finally looked up and saw him, the presentation stumbled for just a moment. Then something remarkable happened. The boy's voice grew stronger, more confident, as he explained the most technical parts of his project. Later, he would realize his son had been speaking directly to him, showing him a world he built without his father's help or money. The judges awarded his son second place. In the crowd of celebrating families, he watched from a distance as his ex-wife hugged their boy, as friends and teachers offered congratulations. He turned to leave, knowing he hadn't earned the right to join that circle yet, but his son's voice stopped him. "Dad?" He turned back. His son stood there, holding his robot, looking uncertain but determined. "Do you?" The boy paused, gathering courage. "Do you want to see how I programmed the movement sequences?" Those words, so simple but carrying so much weight, felt like the first real conversation they'd had in years. They found a quiet corner of the gym, and for 20 minutes, his son showed him lines of code and explained his thought process. He asked questions, not as a CEO or a successful businessman, but as a father trying to understand his child's world. That evening, he sent a brief text to his ex-wife. "Thank you for raising such amazing kids. They're incredible despite my absence, not because of anything I've done." Her response came hours later. "They're half you two. They always have been. They just need to see that part of themselves reflected in your actions, not your bank account." As he lay in his new, modest apartment that night, he thought about how different this felt from his usual problem-solving approach. He couldn't just throw money at this situation or delegate it to someone else. There was no quick fix, no shortcut to rebuilding trust. Every small interaction, every quiet moment of showing up without demanding attention was like placing a single brick in a foundation that had crumbled long ago. His phone buzzed with work emails, board members wanting updates, business partners seeking meetings. For the first time in his adult life, he left them all unanswered. Instead, he opened his laptop and began researching local robotics clubs for middle school students. If his son loved coding and building things, maybe that could be their bridge, not because of his tech industry connections, but because it was something they could learn and explore together. As he drifted off to sleep, he realized something profound. Success had taught him to think in terms of quarters and fiscal years, but family worked on a different timeline. Every day was its own investment, every moment a chance to show up differently. The returns might not show up on any balance sheet, but they were the only ones that really mattered anymore. Time has a funny way of healing things when you're not watching the clock. Over the next few months, the changes came slowly but steadily, like plants growing after a long winter. The billionaire father who once measured success in stock prices and market shares now found himself counting different kinds of victories: the small smiles, the tentative conversations, the moments when his children forgot to be guarded around him. He started volunteering at his daughter's school tech club. Not as a prestigious CEO, but as just another parent who knew something about computers. The first day, he sat in the back of the classroom, watching the students work on their projects. One girl was struggling with a basic coding problem, the kind he usually had teams of engineers handle. But this time, he pulled up a chair and asked, "Want me to help you figure this out?" The next hour spent helping her debug her code taught him more about patience than 20 years in the business world. When his daughter walked past and saw him helping her classmate, the surprised look on her face was worth more than any business deal he ever closed. The pizza nights with his son started almost by accident. After another robotics project presentation, he'd casually suggested grabbing a slice at the local pizza place. His son had shrugged, that universal teenage gesture that could mean anything, but he'd come along. They sat in a corner booth, awkwardly at first, until his son pulled out his tablet and started showing him a new programming language he was learning. "It's kind of like the ones you used to use," his son said, then added quietly, "I looked up some of your old interviews where you talked about coding." That moment hit him hard. While he'd been busy building his empire, his son had been quietly following his footsteps, trying to understand him through old magazine articles and YouTube videos. Now, watching his boy explain algorithms with tomato sauce on his chin, he realized how much he'd missed. The pizza nights became a weekly thing. Sometimes they'd talk coding, sometimes school, sometimes nothing at all. His son started bringing his laptop, showing him games he was developing. One Thursday night, between bites of pepperoni pizza, his boy looked up and asked, "Dad, how did you learn to code?" Like the very beginning. So he told him about his first computer, about the nights spent debugging in his parents' garage, about the joy of making something work for the first time. His son listened with an intensity that made him realize these weren't just stories about coding. They were the pieces of himself he should have been sharing all along. His ex-wife noticed the changes too. He could see it in the way she stopped tensing up when he arrived at school events, in how she started sending him photos of their daughter's soccer games even on days he couldn't make it. Small olive branches offered one text message at a time. One evening, after a particularly good game where their daughter had scored her first goal, his ex-wife pulled him aside. "You're different," she said simply. "The kids notice it too. You're actually seeing them now, not just looking at them." He understood what she meant. Before, he'd attended events when he could, but he'd always been half present, his mind on the next meeting, the next deal. Now, when he was there, he was really there, watching, listening, learning who his children had become in his absence. The tech club at school grew, partly because word got out that a real tech CEO was volunteering, but mostly because he made it fun. He taught the kids how to build simple games, showing them that coding wasn't just about algorithms, it was about creativity and problem solving. His daughter started dropping by, pretending she was just passing through, but staying to work on projects of her own. One day, she showed him an app she was developing, something to help students deal with anxiety before big events. "Like games and stuff," she said casually, not meeting his eyes. But he understood. She was taking her own struggles and turning them into something that could help others, just like he had done with technology all those years ago. The local coffee shop became his new office for a few hours each day. Not the fancy chains near his company's headquarters, but the small place near his kids' schools where the barista knew everyone's names and stories. He'd sit there with his laptop, handling essential business remotely, but always ready to close it when it mattered, like when his son texted him about a coding problem he couldn't solve, or when his daughter's soccer team made it to the semifinals and she sent him the game schedule with a simple, "if you can make it." Those messages became his new priority notifications. The change in his children was gradual but unmistakable. His son's shoulders straightened a little more each week. His daughter's smile became more genuine, less practiced. They started tagging him in social media posts, small inclusions that felt like major victories. But perhaps the biggest change was in how he measured time. Business had taught him to think in quarters and fiscal years. Family time, he was learning, moved to its own rhythm. Success wasn't marked by meetings won or deals closed, but by moments shared, trust rebuilt, and bridges carefully reconstructed. One night, as he was leaving the pizza place with his son, the boy stopped him. "Dad," he said, scuffing his shoes on the sidewalk. "Thanks for, showing up." Simple words, but they carried the weight of all the times he hadn't shown up before and all the promises he was making by showing up now. These days, when people asked him about his biggest achievements, he no longer thought about his company's stock price or the buildings with his name on them. Instead, he thought about his daughter's quiet "thanks for coming" after her games, his son's excited texts about new coding discoveries, and the way his ex-wife had started ending her messages with "the kids are lucky to have you back." Real change, he was learning, wasn't about grand gestures or buying your way to forgiveness. It was about showing up, day after day, proving through actions that people matter more than profits, that presence matters more than presence, that being rich in relationships matters more than being rich in resources. Life has a way of testing your priorities just when you think you've figured them out. The call came early on a Wednesday morning. His company was facing a hostile takeover attempt. The vultures had been circling ever since he'd stepped back from day-to-day operations, and now they were making their move. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Board members, investors, lawyers, everyone wanted immediate answers. The stock price was plummeting. Years of work, thousands of jobs, billions in value, all hanging in the balance. His assistant had already arranged an emergency board meeting for that afternoon. Then came another message, this one from his ex-wife. "She's having another anxiety attack. The championship game is in 2 hours. She's talking about quitting the team." 2 crises, 2 hours, 1 choice. In his old life, it wouldn't have been a choice at all. The company would have come first, second, and third. But as he sat in his modest apartment, staring at his phone, different memories flashed through his mind. His daughter's forced smile hiding her pain, his son's quiet disappointment, years of absences justified by important meetings. The board meeting could save his company. The soccer game could save his daughter's trust. He called his chief financial officer. "I won't be at the meeting," he said firmly. "Handle it without me." "But sir," the CFO sputtered, "this is about the future of the company. We could lose everything." "No," he replied quietly. "I've already lost everything once. I'm not doing it again." He drove to the school, finding his daughter sitting alone on the bleachers, still in her regular clothes, while her teammates warmed up on the field. Her hands were shaking as she picked at the fraying edge of her sleeve. He sat down beside her, not too close, just enough to show he was there. "I can't do it," she whispered. "Everyone's counting on me. What if I mess up? What if I let them all down?" The irony wasn't lost on him. At that very moment, his phone was exploding with messages about letting people down at his company. But for once in his life, he was exactly where he needed to be. "Want to know a secret?" he said softly. "Every morning when I wake up, I'm terrified. Running a big company, everyone thinks I have all the answers. But most days, I'm just trying my best and hoping it's enough." She looked at him then, really looked at him, maybe for the first time seeing him not as the successful businessman or the absent father, but as someone who understood what she was feeling. "But you always seem so confident," she said. He smiled. "That's because I learned something important. Being brave isn't about not feeling scared. It's about feeling scared and doing it anyway." His phone buzzed again. The stock price had dropped another 10%. He turned it off without looking at the message. "You know what else I learned?" he continued. "Success isn't about being perfect. It's about being present, about showing up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." They sat in silence for a moment, watching her teammates practice. Then she pulled her soccer uniform from her bag. "Will you?" She hesitated, then gathered courage. "Will you stay? For the whole game?" "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and for the first time in his life, he meant it completely. The game was intense. His daughter played like she never had before, not perfectly, but with heart. When she missed a shot, she didn't crumble. When she fell, she got back up. Each time she looked to the sidelines, he was there, right next to her mother, both of them cheering. His ex-wife noticed his silent phone. "No work today." "Nothing more important than this," he replied simply. After the game they won, but that wasn't really the point. His daughter ran to him first, not caring about the sweat or the mud on her uniform. As she hugged him, he could feel her shaking, not from anxiety this time, but from joy. Later that night, after the celebrations were over, he finally turned his phone back on. The damage was extensive. The stock had fallen 30%. Several major investors had pulled out. His position as CEO was being questioned by the board. But as he sat in his apartment, looking at a photo his ex-wife had taken during the game, him and his daughter, both smiling real smiles, he felt something he hadn't expected: peace. His assistant called, frantic about damage control. "Sir, what should I tell them? The board wants to know your plan to save the company." He looked at the photo again, at the mud on his expensive shoes from the soccer field, at the pure joy in his daughter's eyes. "Tell them," he said slowly, "that today I made the best business decision of my life. I invested in something priceless." The next few weeks would be brutal. He'd lose millions, maybe billions. His business reputation would take a hit. But sitting there, holding the photo of that perfect moment, he finally understood what real wealth looked like. His phone dinged with a text from his daughter. "Thanks for today, Dad. For everything." No stock portfolio could ever be worth as much as those 5 words. In the end, it wasn't just about choosing between a board meeting and a soccer game. It was about choosing the kind of man, the kind of father he wanted to be. Sometimes the biggest wins in life look exactly like losses on paper. And sometimes letting go of everything you thought you needed is the only way to grab hold of everything you really want. The family therapy room was nothing like a corporate boardroom. No mahogany tables, no leather chairs, no floor-to-ceiling windows with city views. Just comfortable couches, soft lighting, and a box of tissues that would prove more valuable than any business contract. It was his son who suggested therapy first, surprisingly. "My friend's family does it," he'd said during one of their pizza nights, carefully studying his pepperoni like it held the secrets of the universe. "After his parents split up, he says it helps." The first session was awkward. They sat there, this broken little family, each in their own corner of the room. The therapist, a kind-faced woman with gray streaks in her hair, just watched them for a while, letting the silence do its work. His ex-wife spoke first, her voice quiet but steady. "I spent years being angry," she admitted. "Not just about the divorce, but about how easy it seemed for you to replace us with work. Like we were just another failed investment." In his old life, he would have defended himself, would have pulled out spreadsheets showing every payment, every provision he'd made. But now he just listened, really listened, as she described the lonely parents' nights at school, the children's birthdays when they kept watching the door, the way she had to become both mom and dad while he built his empire. "I didn't know how to be both," she said, wiping tears. "I was so tired, but I couldn't let them see it. They'd already lost one parent to success. I couldn't let them lose another to exhaustion." His daughter, curled up in her chair, spoke next. "I used to watch business news every morning," she confessed, "just to see if they'd mention you. Sometimes I'd pretend you were talking to me through the TV screen, explaining why you couldn't come to my games." The tissue box made its way around the room as his son added his piece. "I learned coding because I thought maybe if I was more like you, you'd want to spend time with me. Pretty stupid, huh?" "No," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was the stupid one. I thought I was building a legacy for you both, but I was just building walls between us. Week after week they came back. Sometimes they cried, sometimes they laughed, sometimes they just sat in silence. The therapist taught them tools, how to express hurt without attacking, how to listen without defending, how to heal without forgetting. They learned about triggers, how his daughter's anxiety spiked whenever he checked his phone during their conversations, how his son's shoulders tensed when he mentioned work, how his ex-wife still flinched when he talked about money. It's like learning a new language, the therapist explained. You all got fluent in silence and distance. Now you're learning how to speak family again. The hardest session was when they talked about trust. His ex-wife brought an old family calendar, its pages filled with crossed-out promises and rescheduled visits. Every time you cancelled, she said, pointing to the marks, I had to watch them pretend they weren't hurt. They got so good at pretending, they almost fooled themselves. His daughter grabbed her mother's hand. But Mom, you never said anything bad about Dad. Even when you were crying in your room, you always told us he loved us. Because he did, his ex-wife said softly. He just loved success more. At least, that's what it felt like. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush him, but instead of running from it, instead of checking his phone or making excuses, he sat with it. Let it teach him. I didn't love success more, he finally said. I was terrified of failure, of not being enough. So I kept chasing more, thinking if I just reached the next level, I'd feel secure enough to slow down. But there was always another level. His son, who'd been quiet for most of the session, looked up. Is that why you're different now? Because you're not afraid anymore? No, he answered honestly. I'm more afraid than ever. Afraid of losing you all again. But I'm learning that being afraid together is better than being successful alone. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during a session where they were discussing future plans. His daughter mentioned a school trip coming up and automatically looked at her mother for permission. Ask your dad too, his ex-wife said. He's part of these decisions now. Those words, he's part of these decisions now, felt like a key unlocking something long rusted shut. They started working on new patterns. His ex-wife would send him school updates not out of obligation, but because she knew he genuinely wanted to know. His daughter learned to tell him when she was anxious instead of hiding it. His son began sharing his coding failures along with his successes. The therapist called it rebuilding trust muscle memory. Like athletes training their bodies, they were training their hearts to believe in each other again. One session, near the end of their first year of therapy, his son brought his laptop. I made something, he said shyly. It's an app that helps divorced families coordinate schedules and stuff. Mom helped with the design, and Sis tested it. As they watched his demonstration, something remarkable happened. They weren't four broken people anymore, but a family, different from before, but whole in its own way. The therapist smiled. This is what healing looks like, she said, not going back to what was, but building something new from what is. Later that evening, as they left the building together, not rushing off in separate directions like before, his ex-wife touched his arm. You know what the biggest change is, she said. You're not just showing up, you're staying, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. He looked at his children walking ahead of them, heads bent together over his son's laptop, and felt something he'd never found in any boardroom: peace. I finally learned, he said, that some investments aren't meant to show quick returns. Some take time, patience, and a whole lot of heart. They weren't a perfect family. They never would be. But they were learning, growing, healing. And sometimes that's the most perfect thing of all. 1 year after that mistaken text message changed everything, the family gathered in the backyard of their old house. The occasion? His son's robotics team had just won the state championship, and somehow a simple celebration had turned into something much more meaningful. The backyard looked different now. His ex-wife had finally found time to paint again, and her garden art pieces added splashes of color among the flowers. His daughter's soccer trophies sat proudly on display through the kitchen window, not hidden away like before. And scattered across the lawn were pieces of his son's latest robotics project, which he was enthusiastically explaining to anyone who would listen. Remember when we used to have those stuffy corporate parties here? His ex-wife said, bringing out another plate of snacks. She was smiling, more relaxed than he'd seen her in years. All those people trying to impress each other with business talk. He looked around at the current gathering, his son's robotics team showing off their winning robot, his daughter teaching younger kids some soccer moves, parents chatting casually over coffee and homemade cookies. No designer suits, no business cards being exchanged, no networking. Just real people enjoying each other's company. This is better, he said simply. His company had changed too. After the near-hostile takeover, he'd done something that shocked the business world. He'd restructured the entire organization around work-life balance. Flexible hours became mandatory. Parents were encouraged to attend their children's events. The company even set up a program where employees could teach tech skills at local schools. You're ruining the culture of achievement, one board member had complained. No, he'd responded, I'm creating a culture of life. Surprisingly, productivity went up. Turnover went down. The stock price had recovered and then some, but he measured success differently now. Like today, watching his daughter help a younger girl who was struggling with anxiety before soccer practice. Just breathe, she was saying softly. Being nervous means you care. That's not a bad thing. His son had found his tribe in the robotics team. The quiet boy who used to hide behind his headphones now gave presentations about coding to middle school students. The team had even started a mentoring program using his son's family coordination app to schedule sessions. "Dad," his son called out now, waving him over to where the team was huddled around their robot. "We're trying something new with the programming. Want to see?" Those words still made his heart skip, not because they were rare anymore, but because they were common. His son called him Dad easily now, without hesitation or pain. He joined the group, sitting cross-legged on the grass without caring about his clothes. His ex-wife caught his eye across the yard and smiled. They'd found their rhythm as co-parents, their old wounds healing into something like wisdom. They weren't a couple anymore, but they were something equally important, partners in raising their children. The afternoon sun was getting lower when his daughter gathered everyone for a group photo. As they all squeezed together, he felt his son's shoulder against his, heard his daughter's laugh, saw his ex-wife's peaceful expression. "Wait," his daughter said, pulling out her phone. "I want to show you something first." She pulled up an old photo from 5 years ago, another backyard gathering, but so different. In that photo, he was off to the side, on his phone, while life happened around him. "I kept this to remind me," she said quietly. "Not of the bad times, but of how far we've come." His son nodded. "Remember when I used to think the only way to get your attention was to be perfect at everything?" "And now?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "Now I just have to be me," his son said simply. The new photo they took that day showed something money could never buy: genuine smiles, comfortable closeness, the kind of happiness that comes from being truly seen and accepted. Later, as people were leaving, his ex-wife handed him a small package. "The kids helped pick it out," she said. Inside was a simple frame with 3 items: the accidental text message that had started everything, printed out, a photo of his son's winning robotics team with both parents cheering in the background, and his daughter's latest soccer team photo where her smile reached her eyes. "Someone wise once told me," his ex-wife said softly, "that sometimes the best things in life start with a mistake." He looked around the yard, at the robot parts scattered on the grass, the soccer ball by the flowers, the family photos visible through the window spanning years of growth and change. His phone was in his pocket, silent, because he'd learned what notifications really mattered. His daughter was helping clean up, laughing at something her brother said. No anxiety, no forced smiles. His son was explaining a coding concept to a teammate's younger sister, his voice confident and kind. Both kids wore their accomplishments lightly now, no longer trying to earn love that was already freely given. "You know what's funny?" he said to his ex-wife. "I spent years thinking I was building a legacy through my company. But this is the real legacy." She nodded. "A legacy of healing, of showing up, of choosing what really matters." As the sun set on another family gathering, he thought about that mistaken text message that had changed everything. In business, they called such things disruptive events, moments that forced you to rethink everything. But some disruptions weren't about destroying the old. They were about building something new, something better. His daughter came over and hugged him just because she could. His son followed, no longer too cool for family affection. Standing there in the growing dusk, holding his children close, he finally understood. Success wasn't a destination you reached by climbing over others. It was a journey you took together, supporting each other, falling and getting back up, choosing love over achievement, presence over perfection. The backyard lights came on automatically, casting a warm glow over the scene. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth, new chances to choose family over fortune. But for now, in this moment, they were exactly where they needed to be, together, imperfect, and perfectly happy about it.